preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Thank you very much, Laura. I wish to assure you I am still your moderator, and if necessary, I am prepared to debate myself, demonstrating again the impartiality that the chairman of this assemblage tries to maintain. Incidentally, I'm delighted to see so many of you tonight. I was prepared to tell you what frequently happens at our synagogue when the audience is sparse. The rabbi usually bawls out the audience that is there for not being more numerous. But on the contrary, I wish to compliment everyone who's sacrificed extra hours at the stove for when you could have been using your time to prepare the Thanksgiving turkey. As my publisher at Simon & Schuster said to me this afternoon when I told her I was speaking at the 92nd Street Y tonight, she said, "Speaking tonight on Eretz Thanksgiving?" So, at any rate, I'm very happy to be with you. Well, I thought that I would start not by peering into the future, but by peering backward to make some comparisons with where we are. Many people have noticed and been slightly frightened by certain similarities between the economy today and what they either remember of or have read about the situation that we faced at the end of the 1920s. Notice some of the parallels. First of all, there was already a depression before the crash in 1929 in the farm sector. Farming turned down, prices had dropped precipitously for food and fibers as early as 1926. We have been in a situation for the last year or more that the New York Times, for whatever that is worth, has described as a farm depression. Secondly, the stock market was booming before the great crash came, and everybody thought that we had entered a new era. The stock market, if you measure it by the Dow Jones, or I dare say almost any of the other averages, made a new high some weeks ago when it broke 1,400, and it has since risen. I don't know what happened today, another 60 or 70 points since it made that momentous cracking of the 1,400 mark. Thirdly, there is a good deal of speculation around today, as there was then. It doesn't always take precisely the same forms. Some of you who are old enough to remember it will remember the Florida land boom and the Florida land bust. Florida has had its problems, but I've just come back from Texas, and you can see something that has a good deal of similarity in the streets of Houston and in the streets of Dallas. Not as severe as in the streets of Houston as in Dallas, but a Dallas zillionaire led me to the window of the Petroleum Club to look down on a great, huge, beautiful, modern skyscraper, and he said, "Some people are so damn dumb." The place was about 5% occupied. Wasn't entirely finished, but apparently there were no leases. In addition, we have had a good deal of strain on prices in general. This period that many people still think of as an inflationary period is not all that inflationary anymore if you happen to be not only a farmer but a producer of copper or aluminum or tin or steel or most other metals, probably all other metals, and many other commodities have had drops of 25%, 35%, very steep declines. After, of course, the Great Depression began, there was a similar price deflation. And one of the questions that I eventually would like to address is whether we are either in or are facing a deflation while everybody still talks of the last war, which was the war against inflation. We have also a similarity in our belief today that we know how to deal with any problems that come along. There was a belief which was voiced by the leading economists of the day, such as Professor Irving Fisher at Yale, that so much progress had been made in economic understanding that there was no serious risk ahead. The economists today have been somewhat chastened by their forecasting errors and by a general decline in public esteem for economists, not to mention a White House decline in esteem for economists. And one of the victims, if you like, of that decline was one of our speakers last year, Martin Feldstein. But nevertheless, despite this decline in public esteem, I think that most economists believe that they now know how to deal with problems of deflation or unemployment, and that there isn't any serious problem. In fact, I'd almost go so far as to say that there is an inverse law of economists' confidence, that the further the public esteem of economists falls, the higher the arrogance of economists rise. I trust I am exempt from my self-charge. There's one other similarity that is worth mentioning in a very serious way, and that is that the world financial situation was in a very perilous state in the late 1920s and the early 1930s. The stock market crash ushered in the Great Depression, but I would like to again remind you, those of you who don't remember, that 1930 was not such a bad year. I remember the year fairly well. I was 12 years old and nothing had happened much in our family. It's true my father had been somewhat reckless and had lost some money in the stock market. But as we would say nowadays, 1930 was a second best year. The economy was slipping into a more or less characteristic recession, and unemployment crept upward. But even by the end of the year, it wasn't much higher than it is today. It was somewhere still below 10%, in the 7-8% level. Incidentally, in those dark, dead days, there were no unemployment statistics that amounted to anything. So if we quote statistics for 1929 or 1930, they are ex post facto numbers that were reconstructed from whatever records there were. But since we didn't have an unemployment compensation system, and since we didn't do household surveys of unemployment, you didn't really know exactly what the level of unemployment was. But still, it was not so widespread, and the economists, as I say, have estimated that it was 7 or 8%, characteristically in 1930. So there was not any wave of panic or fear. What really tore the economy apart, it came along a little bit later, as 1930 wore on, and then 31 really did it, because what happened was a bank that nobody had ever heard of in New York at the time, the most important Austrian bank, the Credit Anstalt, collapsed. The Germans, who were heavy depositors in Austria, pulled their money out of the Credit Anstalt, and when it went under, a shock went through the entire world banking and financial system. and other nervous depositors or investors began to pull their money out of the German banks and then out of the French banks. And like chain lightning, this collapse went from country to country, from banking system to banking system. And it was that collapse of the world banking system that seriously deepened the Depression, as it then was called, first as John Kenneth Galbraith mentioned last time, as a euphemism for a crisis or a crash. Depression sounded rather moderate, though to our ears it's like what happened to what was first called the French disease and later was called by the much nicer name of syphilis. Well, when the banking system collapsed, the world economy as a whole collapsed, and that really gave the Depression the coup de grace, and we were years in recovering. As late as when I got out of college in 1940, the unemployment rate was still something like 15%. In 1938, it had risen sharply as a consequence of the new name for economic trouble, the recession of 1937. And in late 1937 and 38, the unemployment rate went back up to about 19%. It had come down to about 14% during the first years of the New Deal. That is, by 1936, it was at 14%. It shot up to about 19% during the recession, and things were still fairly bad by 1940, but the war had come along, and under the influence of rising government spending, the economies were reviving. The final parallel to raise questions about today as compared to those evil times was the world trade situation. In 1929, one of, in my view, greatest mistakes in economic history was made. Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Bill, a highly protectionist tariff measure. Incidentally, it was a consequence of the farm depression. Hoover had been elected in 1928, in part under the promise of doing something to help the farmers. And Congress, especially congressmen from farm states, were particularly anxious to safeguard the home markets for farmers. Hoover, as the party's candidate, was willing to accept that plank in the party platform. American economists did the best they could. There was almost a completely unanimous letter that was written to President Hoover urging him to veto the Smoot-Hawley bill. Smoot-Hawley had become much more than a protectionist bill to protect farmers. As frequently happens, once you have a piece of legislation and there are goodies to be had, in that process of lobbying and putting things in for your own constituents, it had become a generally high tariff bill, a general protectionist bill. It was passed. The Economist urged again the president not to sign it, and he felt politically committed, as he says in his memoirs, and he signed it. Other countries retaliated. The effect was not to protect anybody's farmers or industrial workers or anybody else. Combined with the weakening of the world economic system, protectionism helped to tear the world economy apart. And not only did we slide into depression, the rest of the world did too. A couple of countries had already entered the depression before we had, notably Great Britain, which again may have certain parallels to be noticed. The unemployment rate in Britain currently being at 13%, slightly above 13%. The story, of course, doesn't end there. 1933 brought to power In our country, the election was held in 1932, but it brought to power Franklin Roosevelt in this country and Adolf Hitler in Germany. Now you can say that the Depression didn't cause fascism any more than it caused the New Deal. You had leaders who seized the opportunity, but I think that that's a matter of semantics. The Depression put such strains on the political system that more radical change was required. In our country, with our strong democratic tradition, it took the form of the Democrats relieving the Republicans of power, and Franklin Roosevelt moving into the White House without knowing exactly what he was going to do. He had run on a balanced budget platform. And during his first year in office, he had actually tried to balance the budget. Hoover had tried to balance the budget desperately by raising taxes, the most the taxes had ever been raised before. In our history, there was an increase. When I say raising taxes, I mean raising tax rates, because it was impossible with income falling actually to collect more taxes. But the increase in taxes averaged a 60% increase in tax rates. Sort of supply-side economics turned on its head for the sake of curing the Depression. At the same time, Hoover tried to reduce government expenditures. Balancing the budget was considered a matter of great urgency. Otherwise, inflation would break loose. At a time when prices were collapsing, the purpose of government was to prevent budget deficits, lest inflation take over. Well, the horrible world crash that resulted did, as I say, bring far more dangerous characters to power than Franklin Roosevelt. Hitler, Mussolini was already in office. Hitler's Reconstruction program, full employment program, again had a rather different character from Roosevelt's. Roosevelt entered into the phase of building public dams and clearing forests, refurbishing forests, spending money so that kids in college could stay in college under NYA programs. One of those children, incidentally, was yours truly. I used to sit in the office of the Wisconsin Agricultural Extension Division writing letters to farmers, and I'm still writing letters to farmers. But in Germany, the Reconstruction program, the full employment program, took the form of building up the army and building up the Luftwaffe and spending heavy money for armaments. It took some other forms too. It took the form of building highways. The great German autobahns were started or built during that period as internal communications lines. And also some industrial projects were started. That's when, I may remind you, Volkswagen was invented, the people's car. Ein Volk, ein Führer, ein Volkswagen. Well, of course, it all ended in the most horrible tragedy the world, I think, has ever known. We don't know enough about prehistory, but I think of all recorded history that we know much about, the end of this affair was ghastly and murderous. God forbid that we ever make such stupid blunders that we go through that kind of thing again. Now, that is indeed our question for the night. Having drawn some parallels, is there, in fact, danger that we will reenact the events that followed from, call it 1929 to 1933? Those were the years of the true Great Depression. The rest was sort of inadequate recovery until World War II. Or have we indeed learned enough so that we can avoid a repetition of that evil time. I now want, not for rhetorical reasons, but actually to look at some of these problems, but without necessarily playing Pollyanna on any of them. So I'll take it again from the top. First, the issue of gluts. I think that it is true that there are some major gluts that we have. History doesn't ever repeat exactly. The most celebrated glut of the moment, I would say, is oil. It was a specific consequence of the oil price explosion of the 1970s. Inflation had begun even before 1933. Prices were rising rather sharply in 1972. In 1973, if you take the year from January till October, there was a doubling of world commodity prices. In October, when the war broke out on Yom Kippur, with the Arabs attacking Israel on that day, we then had a further turn of the screw, and a very major one, because right in the wake of the Arab-Israeli war came OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and its declaration of an oil export embargo against the United States, against the Netherlands, and I've never been entirely clear on who else became the targets of the embargo. But the world oil market was panicked, and countries broke ranks, and everybody was grabbing for oil. Oil prices doubled, quadrupled, quintupled by the end of 1974. And consumers grabbed for oil. You remember the gasoline lines, and there we were. That had a major shock effect on the system, and people wrote books saying that we had reached the point of crises, of oil shortage, of energy shortage, and this was the new world in which we lived. Although there was a certain amount of wobbling about in the 1970s, it was only in 1979 that the second oil shock came along as a result of the war between Iran and Iraq. Well, you can call it as a result of the Iranian Revolution and the interruption of oil flow from Iran. But by the end of that whole process, in late 1979, the price of a crude barrel of oil in the spot market had reached over $40. It had begun back in 1973 with the oil price at somewhere around $2. This was a 20-fold increase in nominal oil prices. Well, a lot of people who are not economists thought that this was a perpetual affair. But elasticity of demand was working. People changed their home oil burners, and they changed their cars, and they insulated their houses, and industries did all of that. On the supply side, there was also elasticity of supply. A great deal of oil was discovered or brought out, if it had already been discovered, from the North Slope in Alaska, from the North Sea, from Mexico. Increased drillings all over the place, including Oklahoma, Louisiana, Texas, and there was this enormous price-motivated boom. Well, it came to an end, and I don't think that anybody, including the Texas people I've been seeing lately, think for a minute that that glut is going to evaporate overnight, because both the demand and the supply situation is one that is continuing to put downward pressure on oil prices. OPEC, which looked like a giant, now looks like a pygmy or a crippled giant. It's conceivable, of course, that there could be another war or an interruption of supply that would be so extreme that oil would again become a very scarce commodity, but the answer is probably not. So the gluts are here. And from my standpoint, adding in the ones I've already mentioned, with overcapacity in farm supply in steel, in autos, in non-ferrous metals, and so forth, I think our basic world situation is one which is either one of deflation, in the specific areas I'm talking about, it clearly is, or at any rate, of much slower inflation if you look at economies in terms of retail prices. There was not some wonderful government policy, in my view, that solved the problem. What there was an end of the racing for expansion, a fear of inflation, a change of government policies, and that is where we are. So the gluts are real. What about the speculative issue? Well, that looks rather different today from what it looked before. I don't think that the kind of action we have had in the stock market is at all comparable to what the unrealistic run-up of prices was in 1929. If you look at price-earnings ratios, they're still relatively moderate for good quality stocks. Price-earnings ratios of 10, 15, figures like that, but not 25, 35, 50. That is very much a phenomenon of the 1920s or of the earlier go-go years in this country, and then only for very selected stocks. If you deflate the value of the Dow for the price inflation which has occurred, we are not making record highs in the stock market. There's something strange indeed about why, on the whole, the market, I would say, is as low as it is rather than as high as it is, given the amount of real economic growth we've had over the last, call it 15 or 20 years. So I don't think the market is horribly overvalued. I hope I'm right in saying that. The latest Nobel Prize winner, Franco Modigliani, in part acquired his fame for contending and offering evidence to prove that most stocks were undervalued. And I dare say that that is still true. One of the ways of seeing it is what happens to the value of a stock when you have a takeover offer. The stock may increase 50% or 100% or even more. The book value or the true market value of shares for people to take over the companies seems to be generally a lot higher than the prices that stocks are selling at. And without trying to be too scientific about it, it seems to me that that is the evidence that many, many companies, Pennzoils or even CBS's, are undervalued in the market until somebody wants to acquire their assets. Now, what is the reason for that? Why are they undervalued in the market? I'm not quite sure of what the answer to that question is, but I think it is that companies have gotten the habit, especially big companies, of being very stingy in their willingness to pay dividends. And they would rather keep the money for themselves, I mean for the corporations, never mind any individual self-enrichment or self-aggrandizement. I think a lot of investors are willing to have them do that and take their gains in capital appreciation rather than in dividend increases. They say, why give it to the stockholders? They don't need it. If they don't like it, they can always buy somebody else's stock and not get good dividends. So for whatever reason, I think that the name of the game has been keep the dividend rates down and see the inherent value of the company enhanced. As I say, I don't have a very scientific answer, but I think that market behavior itself indicates that. The one area where I do think that there has been a great deal of speculation, or whatever you call it, has been this enormous borrowing for the sake of acquiring companies. And not only the acquirers have played that game, but the purchasers of junk bonds in leveraged buyouts, I think, have been willing to play that game, that it's been a highly speculative game. It depends on the company, but in some cases the game consists in saying this company is undervalued, we're being offered a great deal of money, the value of our stock will increase, or these bonds will yield a very, very high return, why not accept them? And the game goes on. There's been a great deal of lending by financial institutions, banks, insurance companies, and so on, that have facilitated either takeovers or attempts at takeovers. And I think that that is also true of corporations defending themselves, that they know what the stocks are really worth, they know what their corporations are worth, or at least they know what their own jobs are worth. And sometimes in the fight to defend themselves, there's been a great deal of borrowing, a great increase in debt, and I think that has added to the peril of the system. Another area is the international financial area. And there we have a pileup of debt that makes what happened during the 30s look relatively mild, at least potentially. Third world countries, during the great oil crisis, in order to keep afloat and with the help of Western banks, borrowed over $800 billion. And much of that debt cannot be repaid, certainly not now. It's all that many countries can do to keep meeting their interest payments. And much of the game in the last few years, since Mexico almost collapsed in 1982, has been to keep the game going, to keep the most serious developing countries afloat. And that has been true not only for Mexico, but for Brazil and Argentina, Venezuela, even some countries within the communist bloc, like Poland. So this huge pileup of world debt is a very serious thing, and I don't think that anyone should minimize its significance. On the trade front, we have had a great deal of protectionist pressure in Congress as a result of the troubles of many sectors of the economy, agriculture, mining, many areas of manufacturing. And in the United States, that has resulted from a few things. Most importantly, in a direct way, the overvaluation of the dollar. But what has produced the overvaluation of the dollar? The huge budget deficits. Combined with a restrictive monetary policy to prevent inflation. Those events, in turn, have caused high interest rates and have caused capital to flow to our country. The big budget deficits, which were not very different from the big budget deficits of the Roosevelt administration or even of the wartime Roosevelt administration, have put a good deal of force behind the American economy. We have moved ahead faster than most other countries, and our dollar has risen. But the price of that rising dollar and that high stimulation has been a serious weakening of our trade position, and that has had its impact in selective sectors, including the ones that I've already named. So pressures to protect those industries because of the overvaluation of our country, of our currency, have come to bear on Congress. And had it not been for President Reagan's threats to veto protectionist legislation, we might already have seen a replay of Smoot-Hawley. Now, I'm not saying that we will not or cannot see that again. But the economy is still moving forward, though there are a lot of specific troubles in agriculture and textiles, particularly autos to a somewhat lesser extent now, thanks perhaps to Lee Iacocca, but also thanks to protectionism, to maintaining a lower ratio of imported cars and giving those people like the Japanese a strong incentive not to try to undersell in the American market, because you could profit maximize up to the ceiling of number of cars you could export to the United States by letting the prices rise more or less in line with American prices. So that's been very good for Japanese profits as well as German profits and other car exporting countries' profits. And consumers have paid a price for it. Well, that protectionist threat remains, and Congress has been passing bills like the Jenkins bill to protect textiles with sizable majorities, but not quite two-thirds majorities, enough to override. What is my honest view of whether or not we are going to be able to get through? I give it a high probability that we will get through. And obviously, I hope very much that we're right. And I say it for the following reasons. First of all, on the world monetary system and the dollar, which is the prime aggravant, we have a new Secretary of the Treasury, Jim Baker, who has shown a lot better sense and been a lot more willing to listen to competent economic advice than the last one, who was, call it, banished in shame to the job as Chief of Staff in the White House. Now, I don't mean to underestimate the possible influence of Mr. Reagan as Chief of Staff, but I think the record to date speaks for itself, that there's been a drastic change in U.S. policy, and it has, first of all, had Mr. Baker working closely with the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, Volcker, to bring down the dollar. The famous meeting here in New York at the Plaza Hotel on September 22nd basically reached the conclusion that the dollar was overvalued, or as the communique said, that other countries ought to appreciate the value of their currencies, which is the same thing as saying that the dollar's value ought to be reduced. And during the interventions that followed, the dollar was brought down. It had already begun to come down since February 22nd of this year. We have since had a total devaluation since the end of February of about 17% in the value of the dollar. That's approximately double what the devaluation was as a result of President Nixon's Smithsonian Agreement, which was about an 8% devaluation. It probably hasn't carried far enough. Though the dollar rose from 1980 to currently by about 20% against the Japanese yen until the peak in February, it at first hardly moved against the yen. The Plaza meeting was for the sake of really bringing down the dollar against the yen, and it has. The dollar has now declined not quite the full 20% against the yen, but almost. I think that it will come down further. So, secondly, since Baker moved into the Treasury, we have begun to take far more seriously the dangers to the third world countries, to the big debtors. Now, you could certainly say, and I would certainly say, that not enough has yet been done or put in place. In Seoul, Korea, during the meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, Mr. Baker called for policies that would rescue the developing countries without the United States actually putting up any money. Well, now, how do you do that? Well, incidentally, that was for reasons of budgetary pressures, and I suppose for political reasons also, that nobody loves the third world, and to ask for large additional appropriations with a budget in deep deficit, especially for a Republican to do that, was very painful. The right wing of the Republican Party still has colorations of isolationism. And another way of saying that in anti-terms is anti-foreignism. During the period when the Mexican rescue was being conducted, this group called Save the Eagle, headed by the same Richard Viguerie, who now wishes to investigate the academic world as he has tried to investigate the press for accuracy in media and accuracy in academia. That whole right-wing group have put heavy pressure on Congress to suspend our aid to other countries. It's rather interesting to see Mr. Reagan, who is regarded as quite a right-winger himself, fighting off these people. And sometimes I begin to suspect that Reagan is not as bad as he's cracked up to be. But where he's coming from is another story. And I don't mean to make a blanket endorsement or to become a convert or anything like that. In my usual fashion, though, as I'm sure you will all agree, I struggle for total impartiality, disinterestedness, and the purest truth that I can discover, failing all the time, but doing my best. At any rate, that is my suspicion, that Reagan is a closet intellect. And once in a while, he begins to come out of the closet. Well, he certainly has permitted that to happen this year under the threat of serious trouble, beyond the normal serious trouble. We have also proposed not only that the commercial banks do the lending with a world target of $20 billion, which sounds like trying to, I don't know what, put one finger in a dike that's got holes all over it, and most of them as big as a tank could get through. But at any rate, he did call for the banks to go on lending, and he did call for the World Bank and particularly the Latin American regional subsidiary of the World Bank to increase their lending by $9 billion, both of these over the next 3 years. It's not a lot of money, but it has at least shown a change in policy and a determination to work together with other countries. So I think that what we've seen really is just the beginning, and a very important symbolic beginning before the roof falls in, to prop up countries, to defend the system. And I do think that the change from using Volcker as a whipping boy to working with Volcker and the Fed and other central bankers, again, is a very, very good sign that we know what is happening and we are trying to move against it. I have thought and said since some time before this year began that the most important thing the administration was going to try to do with economic policy this year was to prevent a serious recession. Not for political reasons necessarily. This would have been the logical year in which to have the recession and to clear the air. There's no election this year. Mr. Reagan scored his landslide victory the latter part of 1984. The congressional elections are ahead in 86. Why not have a nice, convenient recession in 85? In normal times, I think we would have. But instead, we have had fairly strong growth, some of it coming off the 84 stimulative measures. But they have continued, and monetary policy has eased. And I think that the basic reason, and as I say, I've thought that since before 84 ended, was that we can't afford to have a recession because the world situation was too perilous. The debt situation was too perilous. And we were in a position where for the United States to fall into that with all the weakness in the European situation might have been to run the risk of a replay of 29 to 33. There's been a very marked slowdown in growth throughout the world economy. That is the basic fact we're living with. And it's not just the United States that has been going through this. We are part of the world, and the things that have affected us, as I kept hearing over and over again in Texas, were things out there, things in the world economy that were affecting the price of oil, affecting the price of commodities of all kinds, affecting the price of standard, familiar manufactured goods, from textiles and shoes to automobiles and even computers and even semiconductors. So if you listen to a few of these growth rates and the changes over time, you can see what I mean. The United States in the period 60 to 69 grew at an annual rate of 4.2% per annum in real terms. In 70 to 79, at an annual rate of 3.1%. And in the period 1980 to 85, 2.1%. That's why we have, in a nutshell, an unemployment rate of 7%, which was once regarded as a high recession unemployment rate. Take Germany, and I'll not repeat the dates. These are for the 60s, the 70s, and the first half of the 80s. Germany's three rates go 5.8, 3.1, and 1.2. And that is the reason why Germany, which had an unemployment rate of between 1 and 2% back in the 60s, now has an unemployment rate of close to 10%, 9% or thereabouts. Britain, which was the slow grower, has become an even slower grower. Its three rates go down 3.1 to 2.4 to 1.1. France goes from 5.8 down to 4.1 down to 1.2. Canada, 5.2 down to 4.3 down to 1.9. The only exception among the major countries, not a full exception, but in terms of deceleration, not an exception at all, is Japan. Japan grew at an annual rate in real terms, that is adjusted for inflation, by 11.6% in the 1960s, by 5.4% in the 1970s, and 4.3% in the 1980s. So even though the Japanese growth rate still remains a quite respectable one of 4.3%, compared to its growth rate in the 60s, it's 1/3, approximately, the rate of growth. That slowdown underlies the gluts. To have gone into a more serious series of negative growth rates in this situation, I think, was perceived to be, and in fact was, too dangerous. So we have begun to try to deal with that problem too. And one of our problems here is ideology. One of the effects of supply-side economics is that you're not supposed to stimulate the demand for goods. You're supposed to do things that are good to increase incentives or to increase productivity, but not to stimulate demand. Well, I think that rhetoric has not stood in the way of stimulating demand in our own country, and it did stand in the way of our urging this during the Bonn Economic Summit last June. But it did not stand in the way of Mr. Baker at Seoul, and I think that, well, it did to some extent. He still is a member of the Reagan administration, but what we are now doing is urging Japan to grow still faster, urging the Europeans to stimulate their economies. They're not all willing to do it. There is not only a cultural lag, there is a self-interested lag. They remember what happened to France when France tried to move alone. What happened was the franc deteriorated, inflation rose, and Mr. Mitterrand suffered very severe setbacks that might have led to the fall of his government. So it's very difficult for one country in this interdependent world to overstimulate. That's been true for the United States as well as for France. So what we are struggling toward is collective action. A united front, to use jargon left over from the 1930s. You remember that we unfortunately never constructed that united front. Not only the Depression, but World War II was a consequence. It was supposed to be a united front against Hitler. Incidentally, the protectionism and the breakdown in world trade had a great deal to do. I've left Japan out of that story, but had a great deal to do with the co-prosperity sphere. Once Japan was shut out of the American market and Western markets, their determination to get other markets in Asia, in Southeast Asia, in China, wherever. That very aggressive combination between Japanese industry and Japanese militarists helped to bring on war in the Pacific So I think that people like not only Jim Baker, but George Shultz, know the story of those terrible years only too well, and the course of policy is to avoid it. Now, I have said before I stop talking that I think that we are going to do it. I don't want you to think, though, that I'm willing to give like a 1.0 probability for that it's in the bag. If you asked me to play games that in academia are called Bayesian estimating games of what I think the probabilities are from somewhere at the back of my head, I would say I think we've got about a 0.7 probability of dealing adequately with the problems. There are a lot of things you shouldn't do in this world with a 0.7 probability, such as crossing Broadway on 42nd Street with a 0.7 probability of getting across. But there are some things in this world that you've got to do, whether you like the probabilities or not. And I think that if we have 6 chances or 7 chances or 8 chances out of 10 of getting through, given everything else we've done up until now, that's not so bad. But it's not a probability, like many things, that depends on nature. It doesn't depend on the accidents or the throws of the dice. It depends on policy. It depends on us. Not only on policy, but our conduct as individual voters, as investors, as citizens, as political people ourselves who have some influence not only at the voting booth, but in our letters and our other contacts with what we want and what we expect. And it's hard to know the prescription for everything, but I think the public has spoken on many of these issues, including budget deficits, including the need for growth. People don't always know what to recommend, but they do know how to express their anxiety and to insist that they hear sensible policies from their political leaders or representatives. And I think that process, too, is going on. So with that, I think that I will stop, and we are ready to try to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leonard Silk, for a very wonderful talk tonight. And we have quite a number of questions. I'll try and group them if I can. Here are several which are related. Because of the less developed countries' inability to repay loans, can our money-centered banks fail? Along with that, how can third world countries ever manage to repay their loans? What are the long-range implications of the world debt for both the lending and borrowing nations?
Well, on the question of whether banks can fail, the answer is yes, of course they can. And this year we have had more bank failures than in any year since the Great Depression. I was going to say, had I been speaking here a little while ago, 100 banks have failed. Since I was just in Texas, the correct figure is 101, because while I was there, the First National Bank of Tague failed. And for those of you who don't know, Tague is slightly to the south of Waco. Well, 101 bank failures is a lot of bank failures. Most of these have been small banks. But that list would have been increased if we could have put the Continental Illinois Bank and Trust Company of Illinois on that list. And that would have created a resounding bang. The fact that Continental Illinois was rescued basically by the government, by the Federal Reserve, putting up several $1 billion, may suggest to you that the banking system, that the government is committed to rescue the banking system. And that's what it suggests to me. I think that we did see a very rapid rescue and bailout with a complete guarantee being offered for the time being to all depositors without limit of the $100,000 official guarantee. What we said, in effect, was Don't take your money out of continental Illinois, no matter how much money you have there. You can have millions, tens of millions, foreign depositors. Never mind. We're prepared to pay everybody off. Well, that was a position that we couldn't stay with indefinitely. It was stated a little bit vaguely, but nevertheless clearly. However, for the time being, that position is again retracted because there is a serious question of equity. Why not rescue the First National Bank of Tague, Texas, or any other bank that fails? Well, there's no clean answer to that question, but I think that the important thing is that Continental Illinois was rescued. Before it, the United Bank of California was rescued. Before it, the Franklin National Bank of Long Island and a little bit New York was rescued. And I think that again is one of the lessons that was learned during the Depression, that we can't wait until that wildfire races through the banking system and the whole economy is threatened. Now, Laura, what was the second part of that question?
How can third world countries ever manage to repay their loans, and what are the long-range implications of the world debt for both the lending and the borrowing nations?
The only way the third world countries can repay their loans is by getting the world economy growing again. That is the main thing, and growing again at a better rate than this average rate of 1 to 2% that we have had during the 1980s thus far. Because at that slow rate of growth, there is no market for many of the products of these countries. And even though they may go on trying to produce, and even though they go on selling goods, prices fall and their earnings fall, so that they cannot service their debts indefinitely under those circumstances. We need to resume growth. And that again was the basic line out of Seoul, Korea, that we must have growth-oriented policies now. We've put countries through the ringer of getting rid of inflation and trying to deal with their balance of payments problems. But they cannot survive on that. And incidentally, our banks cannot survive on that. So that is point one. We must achieve positive growth and at a rate at which we begin to mop up unemployment, which is the basic cause of protectionism. That's the second point, that the other way they can pay off only is if we keep our markets open to them. If we were to lurch into this protectionist mode that many in Congress would like us to do, a majority in Congress say they would like us to do, it would prevent countries from earning enough money to service their debts. And on the next go-round, that would mean a failure to pay those debts to the American banks to whom they owe it. And it would mean the threat of bank collapse. Then I would have to bring the first part of the answer into play, that we will rescue the banks by printing money, in effect. And maybe we can print enough to do it, maybe we can't print enough to do it. But in any case, the threat would be greatly exacerbated, and the threat of default would be exacerbated in all those countries. I don't know what form of political instability it would take, but I can be pretty sure that it would be anti-Yankee, anti-Western. It might mean a restoration of military dictatorships in countries like Argentina and Brazil. It's hard to predict. Although history is worth studying, I don't think it ever repeats itself exactly. All I know is that in such a breakdown, we would have to again begin to worry about a political failure.
Thank you. What do you think of interest rates for the future, specifically in 2 or more years?
Well, in the somewhat shorter run, meaning this year, I think that interest rates will continue to move down, maybe unevenly, but I think that will be a result both of the continued slow growth of inflation, the continued pressure on commodity prices, the gluts that I've talked about, and without policy doing it, interest rates do tend to be in phase with changes in overall prices. It's a bit of a metaphor to say it this way. You can say that interest is the price of money. That's more or less a correct statement. But the price of money is a little bit like the price of other goods. If goods prices move down, interest rates tend to go down. Now, what happens later on is likely to depend on a number of factors, including how rapidly the dollar falls. If the dollar should begin to look as if it's plummeting down, and remember that policy is to push it down, but to push it down into a so-called soft landing. But if it began to fall rapidly, the immediate effect of that would be twofold. First of all, it would tend to cause American prices to rise. We're already seeing some price rises on Japanese cars and other imported goods. Some companies are only thinking about it. Other companies are putting up their prices. Depending on the strength of markets, they may or may not actually raise prices, but since as the dollar declines, their earnings in the United States in nominal dollars decline. And to maintain their profit positions, they tend to push their prices up. A much more rapid fall would mean, I think, a more rapid rise upward in prices before a collapse came later on, but I'm talking about intermediate effects. However, in addition, we do have the second effect, or the second cause of declining rates, and that's Federal Reserve policy. We are trying to push the dollar down. We want to not only help the developing countries and to reduce the value of the dollar, but we also want to keep the American economy moving ahead. We want to narrow the budget deficit, and lower interest rates helps to do that in a couple of ways. First of all, by reducing the interest charges on the public debt, which this year will cost us $170 billion. Secondly, by keeping the economy growing so that with higher income, tax revenues will be higher, and you'll come closer to the administration's projections of what the deficit will be. An economic slowdown, in part caused by interest rates going up, would aggravate the budget deficit. So I think that the aim of policy remains to reduce interest rates. Now, the reason I hesitate a little bit to say 2 or 3 years from now they're going to be lower still is that there are so many hazards on the price front, on the dollar front in particular, that it's possible that to moderate too sharp a decline in rates or too rapid a rise in inflation, too sharp a decline in the dollar, the Federal Reserve may turn policy around. If they do succeed in engineering a recovery, Mr. Volcker, who is a great balancer and leaner against the wind and tightrope walker, assuming that he's still there, which is a possibility, having turned down the World Bank job, we could see interest rates moving up again. I think that Volcker has been playing a very fascinating game of fine-tuning, whatever you call it. You run out of metaphors after a while, but he's tried to counterbalance the forces that either blow toward inflation or blow toward recession and slump. And the aim is to somehow or other maintain a stable growth. And that's difficult to do if you tie the rudder. If you tie the rudder toward a lower interest rate policy. So it's going to make good copy.
You spoke before about the United States economy continuing to move forward. What eventual limits do you foresee in the future, and what are the biggest threats to this forward-moving trend?
Well, I guess that the biggest threats are pretty much what I've already said. That is that these gluts, first of all, should lead to protectionist policies in the United States, and I think that they would be repeated elsewhere. I don't know. I debated this morning for Japanese television with Cyrus Vance and Phil, forgotten his last name suddenly, the former chairman of the Ford Motor Company, about whether or not we had seen the worst of this protectionist threat. And some people are even more worried than I that we're not. But that is certainly a major thing that could crack it. There's an overall debt problem that I haven't talked about yet, which is the consumer debt problem and the business debt problem, not the government debt problem. Consumers are heavily into debt, and they went further into debt in the third quarter to buy cars. They were lured by the automobile companies who wanted to mop up inventories and all that, but automobile sales have come down. It's quite possible that if consumers take fright, they will cut their purchase of durable goods even further in an effort to, straighten out their personal finances. They're already, if you look at some ratios, pretty far extended. Businesses have also undermined their balance sheets. And I think a lot of businesses are trying to also strengthen their positions by cutting their spending. The early surveys of capital spending, in particular the one that was done by Pierre Runfray, indicate a slight decline in real capital investment for 1986. We don't yet have the McGraw-Hill survey or the Commerce Department survey. And despite, though, the recovery of the economy to a more impressive rate of growth of 4% thereabouts in the third quarter, I think that there are considerable worries about the fourth quarter. For all the reasons that I've said, extended consumer debt, borrowing in the third quarter from the fourth quarter, and so on. Incidentally, people in Dallas were asking me whether Christmas sales were as lousy in New York as they were in Dallas. And I said I really didn't know. I had left New York too soon, to be sure. Besides, my wife does all the shopping. So I really don't know. But I did go to Neiman Marcus. Sakowitz is already closed. And in general, you get the impression in Dallas of a ghastly Christmas sales season. I'm now going to do my first scientific of the night, investigation of the night and ask you to raise your hand so I will have some information for the paper. Are Christmas sales lousy? Are they good? Are they fair? Or are they booming? First of all, raise your hands if they look lousy, if you have been in the stores. Are they good? Fewer hands. Do they look sort of medium? No. The lousies seem to have it. If we had time, I'm now demonstrating that I really am a reporter more than anything else. I would like all retailers to stand up and tell me the truth. How many retailers do we have in the house? Well, you only have customers in the house tonight. At any rate, my impression already back in the city is that people are not killing themselves to buy. So anyway, to finish the answer to the question, I think that the business investment thing is somewhat worrisome, as consumers are somewhat worrisome, and we do have the foreign problems I talked about. So I think that 1986 is going to be a year of continued advance, but nothing boomy. I hope that policy will keep it rolling, but 87 becomes more worrisome still.
Along the lines of protectionism, why do we export jobs such as microelectronics assembly to Southeast Asia rather than to Mexico, which should have the advantage of geography?
Well, when you export jobs, if you like, which is to say, when you build plants abroad, it's for the sake of making a profit, not for the sake of geography. And if we ran private investment policies the way we run foreign aid policies, it probably would be more sensible to put more into Mexico. But individual manufacturers of goods, including those, but going beyond those, are impressed with the low cost of production and the high quality of product that they get out of East Asian countries. And I think the answer is as simple as that. With high productivity, as well as lower wages, you're saving a good deal on your labor costs, even at change dollar yen or dollar yuan, which is Korean, or dollar Hong Kong dollar. I better stop the currency showing up. But at any rate, you get much lower costs and higher returns in manufacturing in those areas, and you also get good products. Now, that is another whole issue that we haven't talked about tonight, the whole issue of the weakened American economic performance on the productivity front, on the plant floor front, and the managerial front as well. But I don't want to get lost in that.
A very practical question. Where should one be invested at this time?
Invested?
Yes.
Well, I don't want to be sent to jail from the 92nd Street Y for practicing without a license. The only
pass.
thing, beg your pardon?
You can pass.
I think I'd better pass on that.
Okay.
But I was going to give you a limited answer without mentioning, obviously, any particular stocks. These changes in the dollar value in relationship to other currencies create opportunities of two kinds. One for investing in countries abroad whose currencies will be appreciating. Just as the dollar has appreciated, it's now depreciating. So there may be a play that way. The narrowing of interest rate ranges also may make some of the foreign securities look attractive. But there's also a straight American play in the stocks of companies that are multinationals, because that tends to benefit a company like, say, Coca-Cola or IBM, whose earnings have been hurt by the falling dollar when it comes to repatriating money, and whose earnings abroad will now be reversed and helped by earning more in terms of the foreign currencies in countries in which they operate. So I have thought that the play related to the dollar was the best play that anybody could ask for, and thank God I was right, said he without saying anything further.
In view of the recent rapid rise in the stock market, do you anticipate a temporary decline in the near future? Or perhaps a permanent decline?
I think on that particular one I will pass. That would go beyond any scientific response that I could make, or anybody else.
Okay. In your opinion, these are two questions that are related. In your opinion, what effect will the trend toward mergers and takeovers have on the future economy? And specifically, what will happen in the Texaco-Pennzoil situation? Will there be takeovers? I'm asking dangerous questions.
On many of these, I ought to ask you to call your broker, but on what was the first part?
What effect will the trend toward mergers and takeovers have on the future
Well,
economy?
on the effect of takeovers on the economy, I don't think that one can, or rather one should, overly generalize. There are situations where a company has been badly managed, or whatever you call it, and where there is genuine value in taking over the company. And if you can get it at a bargain, I don't think that it's sinful in the capitalist system for somebody to see an opportunity and get together the money to do it. Having said that, I do think that many takeovers are not inspired by the notion that you can do better than the existing management. It's a straight financial play. And much of this agglomeration that is going on has nothing to do with operating businesses better. It's simply a way of using somebody else's money to acquire a company, and it either may or may not over time sustain its value. But in the meantime, there is a funny kind of a profit opportunity simply because of people's attitudes and expectations, or because of assets that you can get your hands on, concealed cash, or divisions that can be readily sold off, almost in the same fashion. That is in the sense of finding the bigger sucker who will take assets off your hand. And that game of buying and selling and raiding and defending is one that I think weakens the whole financial structure of corporate America, even in the act of defending yourself against it. The CBS case is an example of that, where CBS, in order to defend itself against Ted Turner, borrowed like crazy and turned a reasonably decent equity debt ratio into an impossible equity debt ratio, and then in order to keep its head above water began laying people off. And all of that doesn't make any great sense. I think that one of the fatal flaws, if you like, of capitalism is that it's very easy to acquire somebody's property simply with money or borrowed money or credit. Incidentally, it's what made German industry so vulnerable to Hitler. You didn't have to storm the Winter Palace with sailors firing guns. All you had to do is pass a law saying a certain part of this stock belongs to the state. Well, in the same fashion, if you can borrow enough money, again, without respect to who's productive, who's efficient, who's a good manager, you can take over companies. Now, I've made a large exception to that in the first part of what I said. But I think in general, all of this is weakening our position. It tends not to improve the productivity or improve the quality of products. It has nothing to do with that. It has only to do with grabbing assets and playing a financial game, not playing a serious growth game.
Okay. The person asked, does the United States have two economies, New York and Boston, etc., versus the rest? I suppose they mean urban versus agricultural. And what events might equalize these separate economies?
No, I think that oversimplifies it. We certainly have New York and Boston as examples of, well, call it post-industrial America, in the sense that Boston is producing lots of high-tech stuff and New York is producing a great many services. Not only real estate, but finance, communications, fashion. Well, some of that is manufacturing. But in that sense, I don't draw a sharp line between high fashion and sewing seams. It's basically a fashion industry, not simply a manufacturing industry. But Silicon Valley exists, Berkeley exists, Austin exists, even though Houston also exists. There are other brain centers all over. Pittsburgh is increasingly becoming a center of brains in computer science and not simply a steel manufacturing town. Rural America is in a lot of trouble as a result of the things we were talking about, including some overexpansion during the heyday of rising prices and rising credit, rising debt. But I think that every state has its own variations within itself. Madison is not the whole of Wisconsin, and St. Paul, Minneapolis is not the whole of Minnesota. We're a variegated country. The farm sector has shrunk in terms of population, but it's still very important to the country as a whole. And farm banks and farm towns, which aren't farm towns, but smaller towns all over, are affected by what happens in that economy. I think that we do have to worry about the other America, and not only the poor, but the rural. You know, I was going to say before Laura thinks of it herself that I realize this is Eretz Thanksgiving, and I was going to suggest that we break a little bit earlier tonight, especially since I didn't interview myself. And why don't we take about 2 or 3 more questions, and then everybody can go home early.
I have exactly 3 more questions
for all right.
us. Why do you think the American people overlooked the doubling of the national debt and re-elected Ronald Reagan?
Well, I think the first part of the answer is very simple. People don't like to pay taxes. And to have somebody come along and say, we've got this terrific theory, if we cut taxes, the budget will be balanced, the economy will expand, and this is a good thing, eased the conscience of a lot of people, saying, well, thanks a lot. I mean, I love tax cuts, and if I can do my patriotic duty by accepting tax cuts, I will accept. So theory played a very important role in selling this 1/3 tax reduction in 1981 that was the Kemp-Roth bill and became Mr. Reagan's stamp. Why they go on liking Mr. Reagan, I think, is in part personal. He is a charming man, especially up close. You know, he's a terrific performer and all the rest of it. I think he does have some values that seem to a great many people to be good, solid, traditional American values. There may be a certain amount of manipulated symbolism and all that. I mean, ranging from dress, from jeans, from flannel shirts and boots on occasion, to being the best dressed man in the country on other occasions. So there's a lot of, personal element in that, just as there is for, well, let us say, by a vague analogy, movie stars. But I think there is another element. I've already suggested that Mr. Reagan is a lot shrewder than many people have thought, that he has a certain sense of policy, he has a certain sense of flexibility, which I think he just demonstrated in Geneva in dealing with Mr. Gorbachev. So I think that people have sensed that there may be something there, that at least he knows where he wants to go. And that's the final thing I would say, that I think he breeds confidence on the part of a great many people. They may know his faults. They may know that he's been caught out by the press again in a fib or a fake number or, whatever. But at the same time, they feel there's a decisive and confident man. And I think that they couldn't stand the opposite of that, which they felt they were getting from Jimmy Carter. So that sense of confidence, I think, accounts for Reagan's continued strength at the polls, despite many people's misgivings about policy. The 1988 election was a good example of that. Reagan won in a huge landslide.
84.
The Republicans did not. The Democrats gained seats. Both in the House and the Senate. I mean, not enormously, but they did. It does show a certain kind of bifurcation, I think, on the part of the people. That is, that they are critical of Republican or Reagan administration policies to a large degree, but they like Reagan.
This is the last question. Is the dollar really being forced down, or is it falling of its own weight?
Well, I'd say both. I already said that it began to decline on or about the 25th of February, but it was pushed on the 22nd of September. Even before the 22nd, you might say that the Fed was conniving at some reduction in the dollar. But you've got to go beyond just intervention in markets. I think that what markets sense is that the relations in terms of rates of growth and inflation and government policies for accelerating growth or retarding it, for cooperation internationally, are changing, so that the markets may act, most importantly, more importantly than the central banks. But to a considerable extent, they are taking their cues from the United States government and other governments. So it's a combination of jumping and being pushed. And it would be very difficult to disentangle the two.
Thank you very much, Leonard Silk.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.